I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
Professed values of the Western countries, democracy and constitutional and human rights, at least they should speak about this.
And it's like, I feel like religion just is making it worse. They say they believe in God. I think they're just anxious.
Before we talk about politics, let's look at the fundamental things.
That we, when we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
And it requires people with guts to follow God in an era that everyone does whatever is right in their eyes.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently? Or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah Initiative, conversation without compromise.
Thank you for coming on the Al-Ma'idah Initiative podcast.
Thank you.
Good to finally have you here.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, it took me a while to organize everything. It's been a crazy few months.
No, and I wasn't here either, so yeah.
So you wrote a book. So what made you decide to write this book? It's The Path for anyone watching.
Yeah, and as you can see, it's written by myself and my dad, Hamza Irum Godil. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to this podcast, and thanks for finding that time. And I was just thinking that it's a strong coincidence that we're actually meeting on 30th September, because that would be the birthday of the person whose funeral inspired me to write this book. So I've called it out in the preface as to what led me to write this book, and this was basically my cousin Faisal Nabiwala. He was diagnosed with cancer in 2018, and then he struggled with cancer for a year, but then when his funeral was happening, like, I was invited to a Zoom video call. And technically it's not, in my opinion, I don't think it's correct for a woman to see a male's funeral or vice versa. But then it just happened to be that I just joined that call assuming that it's a family congregation and we're just talking or discussing something. But then his body was right there on the camera. And when I dialed in and when I saw his face and when I saw his body, something inside of me just shook completely. And it made me think about my mortality, which I had never thought of in that way before, because this is a person like my age pretty much, somebody I know, like a year ago, he was told you have 2 days to live, and that's about it unless you start like treatment right away, which he did. And then with a full intense treatment for a good year, still, I mean, he was not able to survive. And this was hard because I was taken away that this could be me and this would be me one day. So that's what led me to write this book.
So just one thing you said that I'd never heard of before. So you talk about the, I didn't write this question down ahead of time because I didn't have it, but you said it's not right for a woman to go to a man's funeral?
Well, not about go, it's about to see the dead body or to see the body itself, and vice versa, unless you are a direct relative.
Okay.
I mean, a cousin is not a mahram relative, essentially.
Okay. So if it is your father or your brother,
right,
or your husband, you'd
exactly.
see the body, but
exactly.
Except for that, you wouldn't.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So one thing that was immediately interesting to me as I read this, and I think this is something I've been fascinated about since I really started studying Islam. But you describe, writing this book, that the difference between the parts of Islam that are directly accessible to everyone and those parts that are not, that fall into the domain of fiqh. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, fiqh.
Oh, very good. So, first of all, could you describe what, before we get into the question, what exactly is fiqh?
I mean, I don't have the details of what is fiqh, but in generic terms, fiqh is just the laws of the religion, like what you call the Sharia laws or the rulings of the religion, like anything, like, for instance, division of inheritance or division of the obligatory charity, or anything that you were to ask somebody as a legal binding, that what am I supposed to do in this situation? What is the situation? What is this? What is the ruling of God in these circumstances? Anything of that sort which requires some kind of a domain knowledge expertise. I would say that's a fiqh.
So
it's part of fiqh.
Okay, great. So with that defined, you describe some things which are directly accessible to everyone and some things that fall into the domain of fiqh. So how do you decide which issue belongs in which category?
So yeah, when I read your question, I wanted to call out that it's not that fiqh is not directly accessible to anybody. Like there is no part of the religion of Islam that is not accessible to a layman or a ordinary Muslim or a non-Muslim. But when we talk about fiqh or parts that I say that a layman should not talk about, it's just the fact that if you don't have that domain knowledge, if you're not that subject matter expert, if you have not spent that time researching and understanding, you should not be preaching and talking about this. Like somebody coming to me and telling me that, okay, what are the laws of inheritance? I don't have that knowledge base. So then there is a dedicated body of scholars who actually have gone in and spent that time and done that research, right? But then what I'm saying in this chapter of who should preach is that there is a side of religion which is specifically the laws of the religion, but then there is the practice and the experience of religion, which any ordinary Muslim and every ordinary Muslim is doing in an everyday life. And I mean, even if people may not be knowledgeable about every single law, they're still following a path. They're doing religious practices, worshipping. There is a core system of belief, that belief in God, belief in the prophets. So I'm just saying that everybody and anybody should and can talk about their experiences and their knowledge based from that perspective, that what does the religion mean to them. But they should not be in a position to go and command that do this thing this way unless they specifically know or have done that research and have those references.
Okay. So you're basically saying that everyone should be confident in talking the things that they are directly practicing.
Right. I mean, this is just like, I was just thinking the example here, the analogy would be of a student or of an employer, of an employee, that when we go to work, like let's say when I go to work and somebody asks me that what are the rules of hiring or laying off or whatever, not everybody can talk about this unless you have access to HR or unless you are in HR body or you have done that under research, right? But then I could talk about what do I do in my specific work? What does that work mean to me? What is my experience? What is the work culture like? Like things that I embody and things that I experience on an everyday level, right? Like nothing should stop me from talking about that. I don't have to be that religious scholar to be talking about my religion or a practice that I am following on an everyday level in my life.
Yeah. So what is it you think would hold back, what do you think holds back more Muslims from talking like this and putting stuff out like this and thinking and talking about this more?
I mean, I think the main thing is that, first of all, people don't really realize. I mean, I never really thought that I would write a book or I could write a book. That's one thing that people just take it for granted, that no, it's something, it's something too hard. People are scared. But secondly, I think there's also the sense of that I'm not good enough. What am I supposed to say? Like I had this conversation with my dad a few years back before writing this book, that why don't you just document everything that you know about Islam? And his answer was that I'm not a scholar and there are so many people who know so much more than I do. So who am I? What position am I in to write this, right? So I think there is this sense of not being good enough or not knowing, and that is what holds people back, or what do I have got to contribute, right? When the scholars are talking about things, or people with subject matter who are subject matter experts are talking about things. That is, I think, the main thing. And the third, I would think, is just ease of writing, which in my opinion, I figured that once I had this Word manuscript, which was just a basic like document that I wrote, publishing itself was very easy. Publishing was the least of it on Amazon or a portal like that. I mean, I used Amazon, but if somebody is questioning that how easy it is to publish something as a Kindle document or on Amazon, I just want to call it out that it was very simple.
Okay. So one advantage of this sort of attitude that I observe is that when you look at people who are kind of experts in religious subject matter, whether they be Christians or Muslims, what I find is the longer you spend in the sort of academia world, the more easy it is to get detached from like regular everyday people.
Right.
So if I'm as a non-Muslim who's studied Islam pretty extensively, you know, when I first started, people would say, "Oh, I don't know anything. Go talk to the scholar," but the scholar would be speaking like a completely different language, and I wouldn't really be able to access anything that he's saying. And also, just sort of bringing friends to church, you get used to speaking in this religious language, and someone comes with you and is like, "What does that word mean? What does that word mean? What does that word mean?" And then like, "Wait, what does that word mean?"
Right.
You're just so used to being in this sort of like little bubble of like your own religion and academia, you sometimes forget how to actually communicate it to like a regular person who's not really as familiar with these things.
Right.
So it's definitely, I definitely appreciate the sentiment to get more normal people talking about these things with some more confidence.
I mean, in my opinion, I would not say that it's a question of detachment, because whenever I have talked to the scholars, like for instance, I'm really, really passionate about Sheikh Hamza Yusef. He's one of the person I always go back to, his lectures or his series or whatever. He's very approachable and he's very direct, and he knows a lot about everyday life, because I think back in the day he was a nurse to begin with, and he was a convert to Islam. He was a Christian to begin with, but I've never felt that he's talking out of context. So I would not say that that's why an average person should start writing about their religion. But in my opinion, it's more so the fact that the more people write, the more people talk, they will bring in a diverse perspective. They will bring in things that others may not have thought about. Like for instance, if I'm a working professional or I'm traveling extensively, I may have some repertoire to share that some other person who may be more domesticated, or somebody who is in a different demographic, may not be able to, but what they will bring will be very different from what I will have to say, right? So this is just, and it will just be, I think, the other part I think is about reaching out to your network. Like just you and I are talking. I mean, we don't know each other from the book. We have known each other from before. Why are you reading this book? Because Irum wrote it, and because you know Irum outside of all of this, right? So I feel that the more people in an average setting who start writing and who start talking, their own networks will get more involved and more interested, and then they will have the capacity to answer those questions, right?
Right. Like I've seen Hamza Yusef on YouTube.
Right.
I've never read a book by Hamza Yusef.
Right.
But I have now read a book written by you.
Thank you. That's a compliment.
So the premise is correct.
Right.
The ideas have much more reach when they're embodied by somebody tangible who people know around.
There is just more to relate to, I'm saying. Like, I mean, clearly, obviously, I'm not talking about the fiqh as I'm saying, which Sheikh Hamza Yusef probably is in the best position to talk about. But I'm just saying that somebody reading this book will just approach it from the perspective of, oh, I know Irum, I've known Irum in this capacity, and okay, this is what she believes. And then there is a different semantic and a different meaning that you associate with the practices or the things that I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. So, jumping into kind of past the preface here, you talk about, one of the sort of first things you talk about logically here is the belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
And you make several cases for why it makes sense. And then you talk about what, if it's so intuitive, why do people struggle with the idea of believing in one God?
Right. So first of all, thank you for sending me these questions ahead of time, because that helped me to practice and figure out. And as I asked you that, where do I say that belief in God is intuitive? And I don't. I mean, the chapter on who is Allah, which is actually is the favorite chapter actually that I have, because in all honesty, I felt that this was more of a calling rather than just me documenting something. It was sort of a revelation. But I have a subsection where I talk about the infinitude of Allah's resources, where I talk about His infinite powers. And there I go in to describe that what we refer to as infinity is nothing but the existence and power of the Lord. Infinity is not something that we can enumerate or bind to a limit. That is exactly how much power and strength the Lord has. There is no beginning or end to it. It has existed from the beginning of time and will exist beyond the end of time. And then what that signifies is that time is a creation of the Lord. So what I'm saying essentially here is that if you believe in infinity, which most of us do, from a theoretical perspective, that there is a finite realm of things and there is an infinite realm of things. So that infinite realm of power, strength, existence is the Lord. There's nothing else. Like, that infinity is nothing but Lord, I'm saying. And then once you start thinking of a being who has been there before time and will continue to be there after time, then that shows that time itself is a creation. Because when a human, a layman, a person thinks about time, they are only able to go as far as back in time as they know and as forward in time as they can think. Like, I was just thinking this morning that how much past am I going to go to? Let's say I even go to the Big Bang point, and maybe I go to the Day of Judgment. There is still a limit to how much I can see, right? But then there is a Lord which is outside those boundaries. And then I'm saying that, let's say that this time is nothing but a creation and it's an x-axis on a plot, and then human life is nothing but a plot on this chart. So then I go to say that if all this is so intuitive, then why are people struggling with the idea of divinity? Because in my mind, this is very intuitive. It just makes absolute sense that that's what it is. But then it sounds intuitive to me, but yet people are struggling with the idea of divinity and one Lord. And that's, I actually have answered your question right on the second page here clearly, that I've said that it's simply because that is the main test. The biggest ask of the human entity in this world is to believe in the invisible Lord. Because this Lord is invisible, he is not there in our visible realm of existence, and that is nothing but our biggest test essentially. That's why we are struggling.
Yeah, okay, so then the sort of, you kind of have this, you know, no God versus God, or no God versus one God kind of test.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting way of framing it, as far as the infinite nature, because one thing I've thought about in that is, if you take a sort of secular, humanist, atheistic perspective, the fundamental belief is the universe itself is infinite. And so essentially what secular humanism does is has an infinite entity which is unconscious rather than a conscious, deliberate entity in God who creates everything.
Mm-hmm.
So either way you slice it, you are left with some form of infinite entity.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't really get away from that.
Right.
So,
but again, I mean, you can't get away from that. Why? Because you and I are believing in God, right?
Sure.
For somebody who is absolutely not believing in it, I'm saying that why are they not able to see that? Or why, I mean, I'm not trying to say that, I can see it because I'm so blessed or whatnot, but I'm just saying that the biggest ask of the human entity is to believe in this in this invisible Lord. And that is why it's a struggle for so many people. And it's not a struggle for many of us, but yet it continues to be the major struggle of the life of many people, right?
Yeah. So, you know, the first sort of stage of this is, you know, is there a God or is there not a God?
Mm-hmm.
Then comes down to the question of religions, like, you know, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what we're starting to touch on page 35.
Mm-hmm.
So on page 35, you said, in conclusion, if someone believes in one Lord and in upholding the best moral code of conduct, but their only disconnect is following the rules of one religion over another, then they need to recognize that at the heart of it, there is very little difference between these rulings. One set of laws is only a subset of a superset of another set of laws, but in essence, their semantics and purposes are the same. One needs to come to a deep understanding of these semantics and ideologies for their own understanding. At that point, they will be able to sincerely draw the right judgment from themselves and for themselves about the resemblance between these rulings. So you talk about people need to come to a deep understanding of this. How do you think a person should go about coming to a deep understanding of the differences and meanings of these rules and religions?
Well, so just to set the stage here, basically it's on the section of whether the belief in the last prophet himself is important, and this is in the chapter of prophecy where I'm talking about Prophet Muhammad's life, and I'm saying that there are many people, especially in the Abrahamic chain of religion, who believe in monotheism, who uphold really good values, but at the same time they do not believe in Prophet Muhammad as being the last prophet. And the question here really is that just, without believing in him as the last prophet, is that still okay? And I have answered your question right at the beginning of this section here, where I'm saying that it's important to deeply and completely understand the other religious narratives that were sent prior to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and what they claimed about his prophecy, as well as about the other prophets who came before him. And to actually, the sentence above it is saying that to answer this question, it's important to realize that per the core Islamic belief system, the prophets who are claiming themselves to be the prophets are not doing so from their own selves. So this is extremely important to recognize that prophecy or being a messenger, being a prophet in all the Abrahamic traditions is a revelation. It's not something that somebody just comes out of the blue and says something from themselves. Now, whether what do you have to do to recognize that Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet or not? I think the fundamental thing is to just go back in history and try to understand and study and research and read the books and see what are the signs, because the Quran is completely talking in multiple places that the signs are all over in these previous books that were sent before him, before the Quran, and they talk about the Prophet Muhammad. So what are those signs? And one needs to do a lot of introspection, a lot of research, and then they also need to do a lot of self-reflection, that what is it that's holding them back to accept these things if they are seeing those signs in there. Is that just peer pressure? Is that just bias of some sort? And that's where I'm calling out that at the end of the day, you don't have to make that justification in front of a community of people. It's not because I grew up this way, or I read it this way back in the day, or because I was taught this way, this is what it is. But you will be answerable for this position to your Lord only. And the more research you do and the more reading you do, you will be able to come to a conclusion for which you will be answerable to your Lord. And that's all that you will be accountable for.
Sure. So it's the when Muhammad was first teaching in Mecca, the Quraysh basically responded by saying, we will never leave the religion of our forefathers and our ancestors.
Right.
So you can't just, you're going to be accountable to God directly. You can't simply say, well, everyone else believed this, what was I supposed to do?
This is not just Prophet Muhammad, this is the story of every prophet, like Prophet Abraham alayhi salam, like the same story. Like, okay, our forefathers, we saw our forefathers worshipping these idols. We have done this all our lives. And I mean, so that is the narrative of the Quran, right? That basically think for yourself and decide for yourself, and that's what you'll be responsible for.
Yeah, so in Exodus, it says, you shall not fall in with the many to do evil, but you shall do justice. So there's always going to be this temptation to just sort of follow the crowd and just, do whatever everyone else is doing, taking their word for it, not asking deeper questions. And I as a Christian, I completely agree that is a very dangerous thing to do. The scholars, your parents, your friends, they won't stand next to you in front of God. Everyone has to answer to God directly.
For themselves, right.
Yeah. So, but part of the difficulty with any of this, right, is the sources are so vast. Like, if you want to go read about, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that is a lot of reading and a lot of research.
Right.
Where do you think a person should sort of start?
In my honest opinion, I feel that guidance is a gift. I mean, it's not something that I think you have to seek guidance, but at the end of the day, the opening of the doors is something that is a gift. And I have called out an excerpt in this book about this book that I've started reading, The Road to Mecca from Muhammad Asad, where he does talk about that how do you go about seeking God? And then it's like, okay, you ask to a God, but if you don't believe in God, who are you asking to? And I really liked what he said at the end here, that if one has not been able to experience God by himself, one should allow himself to be guided by the experiences of others who have experienced him. So I just think that at the end of the day, it's all about what we want to seek and where we want to seek. Of course, there is a lot of research, there's a lot of things, but at the end of the day, we have a brain, we have human reflection, we have our thought processes, and it's about just really taking a step back and identifying that what are we believing, why are we believing, and is that really serving us? And if not, then what could be, and then talking probably to the people, just like he's saying, that being guided by the experiences of people who have experienced God and understanding those narratives, just like you and I are talking right now. We're understanding that narrative, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a Muslim perspective, what would you say the best book is to read, to get, or maybe podcast or whatever's most accessible? What would be the best place to start for getting a holistic understanding of Muhammad's life and character?
Yeah, so as you might have seen that I posted this on my Facebook yesterday,
yeah.
because I'm not an avid reader, unfortunately, anymore. And basically the book people have called out, the biggest one, the main one is Martin Ling's Life of Muhammad. The second one is Rahiq al-Makhtoum, Yasir Qadi's Sira on YouTube, and then 100 by Michael Hart, And then some other people also gave their references on Facebook, which is Rahiq al-Makhtoum seems to be the really popular one, and Muhammad by Martin Lings. And then Sealed Nectar is basically the translation of Rahiq al-Makhtoum in English. And I think somebody called out the Year with Prophet, the series by Sheikh Hamza Yusef.
Okay, I'm currently rereading through Al-Tabari, the History of Prophets and Kings, which is really interesting. It's like not everybody trusts Al-Tabari because, well, the Sunnis of his time thought he was being a little easy on the Shias, and the Shias of his time thought he was being too easy on the Sunnis, and which makes me I can respect a man who gets some flack from both sides. It's fascinating, but I think it's important with any ancient history. There's always vested interests in the historical character. So, like, I think it's easy when you're researching religion, whether that's Christianity, Islam, or anything else. You can kind of like go and it's very easy to like go and look for what you want to find in there, and you find it. Right? So it's like, okay, you want to believe Jesus is a communist. Like, oh, look, Jesus says, "Be nice to the poor," and people just tend to cherry pick the things they want rather than letting. Whereas if we actually believe in God, I think we should be looking for an experience which doesn't just agree with our preconceived ideas, would actually challenges them. Right. Otherwise, there's nothing transcendent going on. It's just a conversation with yourself.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I think that probably describes like the first half of the book.
Okay.
So as a Muslim writing in this day and age, obviously there's a lot of backdrop of growing up in the West after 9/11, and I've had plenty of experience with that as well. Like my journey of studying Islam as a Christian really came when I realized, everything I've learned about the Muslim world and Islam, I've learned from people who agree with me, or I've learned it from the media. And if I look at how the media describes Christianity, it's almost always wrong. So it's like I very rarely see secular Western media describing Christianity and being like, "Wow, you guys did a really good, accurate job there." It's always, "No, you've really missed the mark in actually describing what we believe." And it's like, so I kind of realized, okay, well, if everything I know about Islam comes from the same media that I don't trust to describe what I believe, why on earth would I trust the Western media to describe Islam properly? So you deal with this in your book a little bit. So how would you say the life of the average Muslim is contradictory to how Western media has traditionally thought about Muslims?
I mean, I think the first question I would ask you a question back here is that what do you hear when you hear the Western media? What is your perception of a Muslim there?
It's difficult to answer that question. I got to go back to like 2000 and I got to go back to like 2010 at this point. But basically, I think my general understanding that I got from Islam before I really started studying it myself would be that Osama bin Laden was the dude who was taking it seriously. And there were lots of nice Muslims, but they just never read anything. And they weren't taking it seriously, basically. So I had was, all right, Osama bin Laden takes it seriously, and none of these guys do, and that's Islam.
And what is that perception? It's a negative perception of a Muslim, obviously, right? It's a violent perception of a Muslim. It's an aggressive perception, and that's exactly what I'm calling out, that when you hear about a Muslim, and I think in the chapter on the essence of the Muslim, I'm saying that it's a sad reality of the 21st century that the term Islam and the word Muslim instigates a sense of fear and resentment, which are the two main words to describe, unfortunately, the common man's understanding of Islam in the Western world. It's fear and resentment. But how is an average Muslim's life different? I mean, I am actually using that in a different perspective here. I'm just saying that an average Muslim is no different than an average ordinary person out there. I mean, there is a double meaning to what I'm saying, because partly on one hand that's a good thing because they are not these violent people that the Western world is calling them out, but on the other hand it's also sad that we are just as much consumed in materialism and commercialism as anybody else is. So we have also let go of all our values, and we are also just running after the world and the successes of it as an average person is. But at the end of the day, you are just no different. That is the bottom line.
So the Western media is both too afraid of Muslims, but maybe giving them too much credit as well.
Credit for what?
Credit for being, more sort of detached and serious than a lot of people are.
No, I am saying here in my book that a Muslim is supposed to be living a metaphysical life. They are supposed to be really doing things which are above the realm of materialism, but we are all as sucked up as anybody else is. And when you think of the Western media, that's a different reality where they are just shown as this negative, fearful, resentful person, right? And that in itself is very wrong. But then even so, an average Muslim is just no different than an ordinary human being in this day and age, wherever, West or the East or wherever.
Yeah, but actually, I would say that part of the media perception is that there is that there are a lot of people who are very. I think the media would think the average. Actually, I'd say the average Christian today would think the average Muslim is far more disciplined and far more spiritually minded than the average
Okay, I'm very happy
Christian.
to hear that if that's the case. I mean, maybe that's the part of the media that I don't follow, and that's not the perception of an average everyday learning that we do or the reading that we do, because I feel that the word Islam is unfortunately just always used in a negative connotation on an everyday basis.
Yeah. No, I think part of it though is because there's so many things that are like external in Islam, right? Like there's generally a lot of discussion about Islamic dress code, and we'll get to more of that later. But there's not like a Christian outfit to wear.
Okay.
So there's not like the same sort of. So you can't walk through downtown Seattle, look at somebody and say, okay, that person's clearly Christian, and that's partly by design. Whereas that is generally true for Muslims.
Right. Okay. So in that sense, yes, I guess I get what you're saying. I guess probably that's right. But I'm just talking from the perspective of the general CNN, Fox News, whatever you read and hear, there is that negative connotation.
Yeah.
I mean, when you hear the word Islam, like, yeah, okay, some people are very, very empathetic to you, but some people, for the most part, there is a sense of fear.
Yeah.
Which I'm saying that has nothing to do with an average Muslim. Like an average Muslim is just as consumed and is running after their ambitions and their lives as anybody else is. So there is no sense of aggression or violence in their everyday life.
Yeah.
They are just as consumed by their responsibilities and things in their everyday life.
Yeah, I've had a very interesting experience kind of observing these types of attitudes over time, because I think there's two ways. There's more than two ways, obviously, but there's a couple of ways that I've seen this play out in culture. On the one hand, in more sort of conservative America, there's a lot of like suspicion that's voiced out loud. So, for example, I used to live with a guy who very much believed that everyday Muslim Americans were kind of a fifth column, meaning that they're gradually kind of building with the idea of eventually sort of taking over America. That was very much the mindset he was in. And he talked about this all the time. But there was a Bengali guy who was Muslim and was looking to, rent from him. And the guy lets him rent from him, helps him get a car,
Right.
gives him advice on how you want to marry this woman. Here's some advice on how to talk to women,
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think it worked. I think he's married to that girl now. And so it's almost, whereas I met somebody else. There's somebody else who I was friends with who was very much, okay, well, Osama bin Laden is to Islam what Hitler was to Christianity. There's no connection between Islam and terrorism at all. But then we went over to some Saudis' house for dinner, and the first question this person asks is, so, what do you guys think of 9/11? It's like, really? That's your question for your host? And so I think, I think the personal interactions are key for this.
Exactly.
Because you can train anybody to say the right thing.
Exactly.
But unless they're actually face to face getting to know people, it's easy for that to just be a performance.
And I think that's what ties back into the first comment that we made at the beginning of the conversation, where we were talking about writing a publication or talking more as an average layman Muslim. What difference will that make? And that is the biggest difference that it will make, is that at least you are impacting your own network circles, right? You're basically you're relaying who you really are and what you really believe in, and you're not letting people be just getting all their information from people who are not necessarily representing you.
Right. So for me personally, it was very, very difficult. It was very difficult to get a good representation of Islam from the media. But then the next thing I did is I read the Qur'an.
Right.
And even then, the Qur'an is not the complete summary of Islam either. Like, it's important for understanding how a lot of Islam works, but there's so many layers of what's going on. And what really made it start making sense to me is once I started interacting with people.
I think when you read the Quran, one thing I have recognized, because I inshallah want to dedicate one of my publications to the index of the Quran just for my own self, but you have to know how to read the Quran. Like, if you were to just read verses, even if you were to read the first 2 or 3 or 4 chapters, it can be intimidating in the beginning if you don't know what are you reading, in what context, in what setting are these verses being said.
Right.
You can be turned off, unfortunately, if you are not recognizing those things. And what you have to understand is that the Quran was not revealed in the order in which it is documented. There is a portion of the Meccan society which is basically the latter chapters for the most part, and the chapters of Surah Baqarah and the other chapters are basically like they were in the Medinan society, where people were asked to combat in self-defense, where they were said, where it was told to them that now fighting in self-defense is okay for you. Standing up for yourself is okay for you. But if an ordinary person just goes in and they extract like verses from here or there, yeah, they could have this misperception of the religion.
Right. So, one sort of slightly more benign example of this would be Surah Al-Fil, for example.
Okay.
Right. So it talks about the day of the elephant.
Right.
But it doesn't, in itself, it doesn't explain exactly what's going on there.
Right.
You ask most Muslims, what is that referring to? Well, it's talking about when the king of Abyssinia came up to Mecca with an army including an elephant.
Right.
But that, you don't find that information in the book itself.
It is a summary. It is a summary in essence, right? I mean, it's not, everything is not laid out. You have to know what they're talking about.
Right. So the Quran reads what the Quran reads as, to me, is he's speaking to his society at the moment, and he's saying lots of things that the average Arab at the time would just find intuitive.
Exactly, like this incident of Fil, like whatever that whole incident is, essentially people in Mecca experienced that, right? They saw that an army was coming towards the Kaaba and how it was stopped in its tracks. For them, for that community, that was like a known historical event. Just like you and I are talking about 9/11. We know the roots, we know the history, we have lived through the time and the period. If somebody just brings it in, and now let's say 30, 40, 100 years down the road, somebody maybe, oh, exactly what happened then, or what did this mean, why this, why that? Obviously, like, I'm just saying that you have to understand that the context in which things are revealed, and to the community to whom it is revealed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're just starting with no Islam knowledge, like straight into the Quran, like I was, just like a lot of that stuff is missing, and you only start to fill in the
I also think
pieces.
That you have to relate this similarly to the other religious books. Like, I have not completely sat and read the Old Testament or the Bible, but from the talks that I hear from some of the scholars here and there and excerpts that I hear, there are some similar strong words in those books too, And again, it would go back to the same question, that are these things just talking about in everyday life, or are they talking about specific scenarios, specific situations, and what is the context, and in what settings are we talking about these things?
Yeah. Well, yeah, one thing I kind of realized about that stuff pretty early on is, when you talk about the link between terrorism and Islam. Well, when the Quran and the Sunnah are written, there's no gunpowder. So you can't, as much as people want to say it, you can't just go into the Quran and Sunnah and say, okay, I should be a suicide bomber. The concept would be completely foreign to anyone living at the time.
I mean, I guess that, and in general, like the idea of any form of violence, whether it is with whatever weapon you are talking about. But I mean, it's good that you raised that subject, because that was the key chapter that I had my father write for me, and I really want to give him the credit, because honestly, I feel that I'm not the subject matter expert there, and I'm not that courageous either. But he wrote that chapter for us, and I really wanted him to leave this legacy for me and for the rest of the society here, that what is this deal of Islam versus terrorism. And I think what I really liked is that as he writes here, that when I asked him to write this chapter, I gave him the topic of Islam and terrorism, and he reworded it to Islam versus terrorism, because if you are to say Islam and terrorism, it sounds as if the two are the same thing. But when you're talking about Islam versus terrorism, they are really two different things. And what is one over the other? Like, terrorism is nothing but intimidating people to get some ideological gain, whereas the internal meaning of Islam is peace, or an ideology of peace. So I would really suggest my readers to read through this and understand. But at the end of the day, the bottom line here really is that you have to take the chapters of the Quran in reference, in context, not just extract things here and there from wherever. And if you are doing that, then do the same for the Bible and for the other books, because we can definitely find those topics in those books as well, right?
I think, yeah. So I think what most people miss is they interpret all the sort of verses about jihad with 9/11 Osama bin Laden in their imagination. But early Islam is really about war between states.
So
it doesn't talk about, it's not talking about one rogue guy going into a marketplace somewhere and killing a bunch of people. I mean,
first of all, let's set that boundary very clear, that in any form of war, jihad, whatever you're calling, any innocent life is forbidden to be killed, whether it is like any civilian, any regular civilian, any woman, any child. That's a complete no-no. That's out of the game, which is unfortunately not the world that the terrorists or what we are perceiving in this world, in this day and age, right, to begin with. Now, to talk more about the specifics of when is jihad applicable and what does it really mean, I'm going to defer this question because I'm not a subject matter expert, but I've recently started listening to some of the lectures, and I think my best one was from Javed Ghamdi, where I was really trying to understand what does it mean and what are the things, in what conditions does it apply. And then, I mean, as my father has called out, that essentially this is to talk about fighting in self-defense. I mean, it's one thing to say that any everyday event or terrorist attack is jihad, versus saying that no, now you are actually starting a war in self-defense for something specific.
Yeah, I think anybody here should just kind of go and read the history before they jump to any conclusions about this. So you look at you look at the life of Muhammad, you look at the earliest caliphs. There's places to kind of read and understand that. But that's the context for the Islamic sources. It's not 9/11. And there's we in America, we will talk about, we have the 4th of July every year as well. Right? So we have parts of our history that glorify war to some extent. Like, not saying, oh yeah, people dying is great, but that recognize the justice of a situation, the injustice of a situation. And,
exactly.
You need to understand it from the perspective of the people who are fighting it.
And you also have to look at all sides of the story. I think one other important thing that I think we need to do, and I need to do, and everyone really should do, and all Muslims should do, is really understand what is happening on the stage of the world today. Where are things going? Why are people taking things in their hands? Why are they coming to these really adverse reactions? There is something that is a trigger, obviously, something that has caused them to. So we need to understand also how are other people, other nations, or other set of communities being treated that is causing some people to just take the religion in their hands in that way.
So let's talk more about that. But before we do, let's switch over to the after show.
Okay.
So thank you guys for listening to the Al Maida Initiative podcast. You can join us right now for the after show, or we'll see you next time.